Hi friends, I'm Janet Williams. We at Women of Grace are dedicated to the authentic Catholic spiritual formation of women. It is to this end that we offer you Grace Under Fire to expose the darkness of false spiritualities and contemporary trends.
Hello, you're listening to Grace Under Fire, a podcast of Women of Grace. You know, people ask us all the time, what's so bad about mindfulness? Well, as I'll explain in a minute, there's nothing wrong with the concept of mindfulness, which is just being mindful of the moment. The practice of mindfulness, which is so prevalent today, is where all the concerns are. As I explain in my book, A Catholic Guide to Mindfulness, today's popular practice of mindfulness is derived from the Buddhist tradition. It's the seventh step in the Noble Eightfold Path, which Buddhists believe is a process that leads to awakening to one's true nature. They call it right mindfulness, which means controlling thoughts by maintaining awareness and focus on the present moment. Now, the way it's practiced usually involves Buddhist meditation techniques, such as breathing space meditation or body scan meditation. This form of mindfulness is now widely used in therapy to treat PTSD, depression, many forms of anxiety. It's known in the medical field as the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Program, or the MBSR. The man who introduced this to the West is a biomedical scientist named Jon Kabat-Zinn. He was a practicing Buddhist and a board member of the Mind and Life Institute. That's an organization dedicated to exploring the relationship of science and Buddhism as a way to better understand the nature of reality. Kabat-Zinn always believed his karmic assignment was to find a way to bring his Dharma practice together with his scientific pursuits to create one unified whole. While on a Vipassana retreat, and Vipassana is another form of Buddhist meditation, he had a vision in which he saw a way to do this through a program that he would later call the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Program. And this program was designed to be patient-centered, and it would be used in hospital settings to treat people with stress and anxiety disorders. However, with the core of the program being intensive training in mindfulness meditation, he knew that these Buddhist roots would make people nervous. And he was afraid of being called a New Age kook. So, and in his own words, he says he bent over backward to find ways to employ the program without revealing its Buddhist roots. Now that subterfuge has been the source of much of the controversy and suffering about mindfulness that's experienced by patients who are being treated with this technique without being informed of its Buddhist roots. For Christians or anyone who might seek therapy without having to deal with religious trappings, this wasn't acceptable. To tell a patient that they're just being trained to be mindful without clearly stating that the method requires participation in Buddhist meditation techniques is a violation of a patient's right to be fully informed and to provide fully informed consent. But that's not the only problem with the modern mindfulness movement. Contrary to what is being widely reported in the press, the credible science behind this technique is shockingly thin. For example, in 2014, researchers at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, they reviewed nearly 19,000 meditation studies, and they came up with only 47 that met their criteria for a well-designed study. Now, most of the studies, they were either conducted by or funded by proponents of mindfulness, which made the studies biased, or the cohorts were too small. There was a problem with all of them except for 47. And just those now that had to do with mindfulness, because they were also looking at different forms of meditation, are those that were using those forms of mindfulness meditation. Of the 47 that made the cut, they found only a small to moderate effect of mindfulness in reducing emotional symptoms and no evidence that mindfulness programs were better than the other treatments. Now, this lack of evidence in support of a practice that has now made its way from hospitals and therapy couches to the boardroom and even elementary schools, that caused 15 prominent scientists to publish an article in a very prestigious scientific journal calling for more rigor and less hype in the burgeoning mindfulness industry. They wrote, "Misinformation and poor methodology associated with past studies of mindfulness may lead consumers to be harmed, misled, and disappointed." But all of this is not to say that there's anything wrong with wanting to live mindfully. We can and indeed we should live this way. But first we have to understand the vast difference between the concept of mindfulness and the practice of mindfulness. As Dr. Gregory Popcak once explained to me, he said, loosely speaking, mindfulness, strictly understood as a concept, is basically the mechanism that governs free will. It's the amount of space that exists between my emotional reaction and my behavioral response. If I just react to everything, I'm not being mindful. I'm reactive, and generally speaking, that's unhealthy. On the other hand, when something happens to upset us and we discern a more appropriate way to respond than lashing out, we're being mindful. That's the concept of mindfulness. Now, the practice of mindfulness, on the other hand, which is modeled on the MBSR method, is another thing altogether. As Dr. Popchak states, he says the MBSR is a systematic Buddhist-based approach to teaching the concept of mindfulness. The goal may be perfectly healthy and appropriate, for example, teaching a person to respond rather than react, but MBSR draws from an Eastern spirituality that focuses on the destruction of the self and the denial of objective truth. Obviously, all that is problematic from a Christian point of view. So today's practice of mindfulness is different from the basic concept of mindfulness because of how it's practiced. Most of the mindfulness being used by psychologists today is the MBSR version. But can that be secularized? Can we take the spirituality out of it? Well, that's the stuff of another podcast. Check it out in our library at womenofgrace.com under the title, Can Mindfulness Be Secularized?
If you would like more information on how you can participate in a Women of Grace study, contact us at info@womenofgrace.com. Listen to Grace Under Fire every Wacky Wednesday on Women of Grace Live at 11 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.